Gardening is always ranked as one of the most popular pastimes in Britain. Surveys show that an estimated 40% of the population engage in some gardening activities, with an average of 2 hours spent gardening each week. The horticultural industry contributes about £40 billion to the British economy and supports over 750,000 jobs. For most gardeners, their contact with this huge industry is their local garden centre. In the last 40 years, these have developed from small plots on the edge of town to major corporate businesses. Nestled just outside the village of Oakington, where Cambridgeshire's flat fields stretch into sky, a quiet transformation has taken root. This is the story of a family, a field, and a 40-year journey in growing not just plants, but community.
My mum and dad started the garden centre in around 1980, 1981. It was the result of really neither of them knowing what to do. They'd both grown up on farms. They loved freedom and being outside. I think my father had some plan to be a gamekeeper, but my mother was incredibly green-fingered, and it was her idea to start the garden centre as a plant nursery. And I think the rest of the family thought that they were completely mad. And were very worried about them. They were very brave. They were only in their mid-20s, and they were literally selling plants that they'd grown by the side of the road. So they started before I was born. I think I came along about 3 years later. By that point, they'd got some polytunnels set up and a car park, and they built the greenhouse, and they were operating as a proper business by that point. And we lived down the road, just 2 minutes down the road, in a little farm cottage. And then my sister came along a couple of years later, and then by 1990 we also had my brother. And at around that time they were so busy that they decided we needed to live on site. So just before my mum had Sam, they built the bungalow, and we all moved in on site. And at that point, the garden and the garden centre, there was no boundary between the two, so we literally spent our early years growing up in the garden centre.
Through the 1990s, the landscape around Oakington began to shift. Orchards gave way to development. The customer base grew more diverse, driven by Cambridge's tech boom and a new generation of garden lovers.
They started off as growers. It started off as a plant nursery. They found that there were particular things that they could grow very well, things like Leylandii, which were very popular in the 1980s. But as it became busier and more popular, they found that they were growing less and less themselves, surely because they didn't have time. It was very much a sort of 2, 3, 4-man operation in the early years, and there just wasn't the manpower to keep the growing up. So I would say within the first 10 years, slowly but surely, the growing faded away, and they ended up buying more and more in. A lot of it was from local growers. They made good friends with various people in the local area who were growing things like roses. And then as it got even bigger, that's when they started making connections with their suppliers from Holland.
As the business expanded, the Sadler family started to diversify, starting with providing for the ever-expanding Christmas market. This market has seen an incredible boom in the last decade, with about £50 billion spent on Christmas-related items in the UK. This was also a good way of increasing trade in the winter months, which tend to be a quiet time for the horticultural business. By 2010, garden centres had become destinations, places to browse, relax and dine. The Sadlers opened a cafe committed to homemade, locally sourced food.
The idea of having a cafe is something that my parents resisted for years. I would say by the mid-90s, people were going to garden centres for an experience, but it really wasn't until the end of the 90s that my parents decided that they needed to do the cafe. And they didn't have any experience of the service industry, and I think they were really nervous about it because it was a completely new thing for them. But really, it transformed the business. When they started it, it was with the principle that they would never serve anything they wouldn't eat themselves, so everything was homemade, and they've carried that on. So as the years have gone on, and as Cambridge and the surrounding villages have developed, the cafe has become really like a community hub. It's really, really popular.
Led by the next generation, Sam stepping in 2011, Philippa in 2018, Patricia in 2023. The family grew into the business, blending tradition with fresh energy.
So when I was growing up here, I really took the slightly unusual childhood that we were having for granted, and through my teenage years and my 20s, I had absolutely no interest in the garden centre. I thought it was really embarrassing. I think my brother was the first one to get involved. He had a real interest in catering and in food, so it was the natural thing for him to step into helping run the cafe. And then my sister, who was working as a secondary school history teacher, she was the next one to get involved because she had an interest in retail, and she was looking at the shop and thinking, you know, we could do more here. And then finally, I was the last one standing, and I was working in a school. I was working as an assistant head teacher in a primary school, and I'd built up this experience of management and leadership. And then when I had my children in my mid-30s, and I looked at the garden centre and thought, well, really, the next step is about leadership and about management, and I could help with that. And I looked at it with adult eyes and saw the huge potential that was here, and what a shame it would be if my parents sold it. And that was a real moment where the scales really dropped from my eyes and I grew up.
In 2020, the Sadlers made a return to growing their own plants. Driven by sustainability and independence, they built new polytunnels, harvested rainwater, and rekindled the joy of raising rare and beloved varieties from seed to shelf. This wasn't just cost-saving, it was climate-conscious gardening.
So we decided to start growing our own plants again for a number of different reasons. One was to cut down on our carbon footprint because plants were coming in from Europe, and we felt that this was a much more sustainable way to produce plants for the customer. Another reason was to cut costs because we found that our suppliers were, their costs were going up, and we were able to produce plants more cheaply if we grew them ourselves. And then we were able to pass that saving on to the customer. So those were some of the bigger reasons. Other reasons were that it allowed us the choice to choose what plants we wanted to sell, which has been lovely, and that we were able to offer ranges that might be useful to landscapers or people that had large projects, because we can produce a large amount of plants at a low cost. The plugs come to us as tiny little plants earlier in the spring, and underneath in the polytunnel they grow very, very quickly into a beautiful plant like this. These are a lovely example because we were able to choose the variety of petunia that we wanted to grow, and this is the kind of thing that we might not be able to get from a supplier, and they're absolutely beautiful. So this is the finished article that we would sell to the customer much more cheaply than our competitors.
Today's gardeners may have less space, but no less passion. The shrub A to Z may have shrunk, but in its place, pollinator-friendly perennials, wildflowers and herbs thrive. It's a quieter revolution, one that reflects both shifting trends and deeper values. In 2024, the Sadlers planted their own orchard, an echo of the ones lost to time. Plans are underway for a lavender field and wildflower meadow in 2025, and family-friendly events like the new Pollination Festival invite the public to connect, explore and grow. In 2025, the Sadler family took Oakington Garden Centre's vision of the future to Chelsea Flower Show, the most famous gardening event in the world, and were awarded a silver gilt medal.
So the story of Chelsea is really happenstance and stems from an idea I had around promoting our values through a pollination festival, which I'm hoping for us to do every year. I think my parents thought it was a bit silly, but we had the first one last year. And it was a wonderful event with a flower show. The Beekeepers Association came with a working beehive. We had flower crowns, local fruit. It was a wonderful event. And then about a month afterwards, I got an email from someone who lives in the village who happens to be a scientist working at the Sainsbury Laboratory at Cambridge. And she said, I went to your pollination festival. It was fantastic. And I wonder if you could help us. We've been invited by the RHS to exhibit at Chelsea this year. As part of our exhibit, we need a pollinator-friendly garden. We're not gardeners, we're plant scientists. Would you be prepared to help us? I think that garden centres are really, really important places for promoting sustainability and the environment. And I think take the future of garden centres is in being places that set an example and that lead the way. So really, in terms of our future business plan, it's absolutely key. And growing our own plants has been part of that because it cuts out the middleman, it cuts out the carbon footprint of production. And then looking at things like using the polytunnel roofs to harvest our own rainwater. And then looking at the roofs of the shop in the future, can we use solar panels? What can we do? So it's an ongoing project, but really the goal has got to be as sustainable as possible, and to be promoting environmental causes as much as possible and inspiring people.
Oakington Garden Centre is more than a business. It's a living legacy, built on care, sustained by community, and always growing. From field to family, from past to future, this is a story rooted in love, in nature, and in the belief that even the smallest seed can change the world.